Hey everybody, in this lecture we're going to talk about swing music and World War II. The circumstances of World War II was going to greatly broaden the appeal of swing music, both domestically here in the United States and also internationally. As American service members spread all over the globe during the war, they brought their music with them and shared this music with international audiences. And because of this, swing music has always served as the soundtrack for World War II, so identifiable with that war. One of the most cliched things from any movie about World War II is to play this song. This is In the Mood by Glenn Miller. And when you start hearing this song played, it immediately places you within the frame, the mindset of World War II era America. And so we're going to talk about the relationship with this music and World War II. The place to start is with the war itself. America enters the war at the end of 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and the United States goes to war against Japan, Germany, Italy, and its allies fighting the war. What I want to talk about, and what Ehrenberg just talks about in the book in terms of getting us to understand the relationship between swing music and World War II, was the ideological nature of World War II. Wars are always complicated things, fought for many reasons. But World War II had a heavy dose of ideology. It was a war of ideas. The United States saw itself as a democracy fighting for sustaining equality and freedom in the world, and many of its allies saw themselves as doing the same thing, fighting against the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, totalitarian dictatorial nations that were in varying degrees imbued with racist ideologies. And so, because the United States was at war, for example, against the Germans and their dictatorship, their totalitarianism, and their avowed racism, the United States placed itself in opposition to its enemies. We are the opposite of that. They are totalitarian. We are democratic. They are avowedly racist. We are egalitarian. Okay. And Ehrenberg wants us to understand this ideological nature because what has been his argument this whole time that we've been talking in these lectures and you've been reading in the book? It's that there was something essentially democratic about swing music. There was something essentially egalitarian. There was something essentially participatory about swing music. And notice what America is now fighting a war where it claims to be fighting for these very things, for democracy, for equality, for the right of citizens to participate in the destiny of their nation. And so swing music is such a big part of World War II, not simply because that was the popular music during that period of time. Ehrenberg argues there's something much deeper about this connection, that the very ethos of swing music jived with the ideological dimension of World War II. Let's talk a little bit about propaganda during World War II. Here's something from a German propaganda poster of Adolf Hitler dressed in gleaming, almost chrome-looking armor, holding a Nazi flag, like some sort of white knight defender of the German Republic. Could you imagine an American propaganda poster that had, say, Franklin Roosevelt, who's the president During most of the war, Frank Roosevelt dies towards the end of the war, and his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. But could you imagine a similar kind of American propaganda poster with, Franklin Roosevelt looking all hard in armor, holding an American flag? Like, no, that doesn't really work. That doesn't resonate with the Americans. The Americans thought they were fighting not for the president of the United States. No American goes to war to defend the president. Americans go to war to defend ideas. The homeland, yes. The people, yes. But often the thing that inspires Americans is a kind of shared political vocabulary. Now, what we have here on the right was some works of art from Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell was a famous illustrator. He was most famous for doing the cover of a very popular magazine, the Saturday Evening Post. And Rockwell did the covers for the Saturday Evening Post for decades. Right? And during World War II, President Roosevelt talked about why the Americans were fighting this war. And in particular, he talked about, and this became a famous idea, that Americans were fighting for 4 freedoms. And each one of these pieces here that Rockwell illustrated represents each of these 4 freedoms that Roosevelt coined. So this first image is for freedom of speech. That's one reason why the Americans are fighting. That's one freedom, freedom of speech. Here is freedom of religion. This one is freedom from fear. And this one was freedom from want. Okay. I'm going to save this one for last. Let's talk. This is freedom of religion. We have different people, different ages, some different skin complexions. Here we clearly have a Catholic holding a rosary. And so this reflects the diversity of American religious faith. So we are fighting to maintain our cherished principle of religious freedom. This is the most subtle of them. This is freedom from fear. The key to understanding this one, and it's impossible for you guys to see on this one, is this newspaper that the father is reading. So the mother and father are safely tucking their children into bed. And this newspaper headline is talking about horror and bombings. During several years during World War II, the Nazis were firebombing places like London, trying to bomb England into submission. So this father was just reading the newspaper about the bombings going on in London and was imagining what English parents must have been feeling like at that time, where English parents are putting their children to sleep and not sure if a Nazi bomb was not going to hit their neighborhood and kill their family, kill their children through the night. And so this father, that wasn't happening in the United States. So we were fighting this war to make sure that didn't come to our shores. So this was freedom from fear. Freedom from want, we were fighting to maintain our way of life, our economic viability. This is a bountiful looking, Thanksgiving or Easter celebration where there was enough food for all. This one, freedom of speech, is my favorite because there's so much going on here. Look at this guy's face. Okay, what would it look like if Abraham Lincoln and George Washington had a child? What would their child look like? I would argue that's what the love child of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin would like. And I really think that's what Rockwell was going for here. I think he morphed he morphed George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and came up with this guy's face. And notice something about this guy. This guy is from the working class. Notice his clothing. This guy looks like he just got off work from a factory or a gas station or something like that. Okay. This is some kind of town meeting where this guy is standing up to speak. That's not a normal part of this guy's job, right? That's not what he normally does. But in America, even a worker can stand up and express their opinion. Look at this older gentleman looking approvingly at the younger man standing up to rise. He appreciates it. Isn't that wonderful? The image is larger here. This one's cut off, but this guy right here, he's wearing a very nice suit, has a really nice tight haircut. This guy looks like a businessman or a lawyer or a doctor. And look, he's literally bending over backwards to see what this working class guy has to say. America, freedom of speech. And so this is why we are fighting World War II, according to Norman Rockwell and Franklin Roosevelt. This was the four freedoms. This is how America saw itself fighting this war. Okay, and so Ehrenberg wants us to understand that part of the reason swing music becomes so identifiable with swing culture is because the participatory, democratic, egalitarian nature of swing culture very much fit the mood of the country that saw itself as fighting a war for democracy, freedom, and equality. Okay. Now, in this chapter on World War II, Ehrenberg writes a lot about one band leader, Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller becomes really popular during World War II. One of the things Miller did that was the key to his success was he created a very accessible, poppy version of swing. In fact, some people even referred to it as swing. It was very melodic. It was danceable, but not aggressive. There was soloing, and there were excellent soloists in his band, but it wasn't that kind of hardcore, free-for-all kind of soloing. It was really a kind of music geared for a middle-going audience. Let's listen to a little bit. Let's listen to a little more of Glenn Miller. Really good beat. Great song to dance to. Very hooky melody. You hear the song and you're humming it for the rest of the day. And you didn't have to be some kind of hardcore jazz aficionado to like this song. Okay. What Glenn Miller did with this sweet swing sound was he brought a whole new groups of people to appreciate swing music that had maybe never appreciated before. Maybe Glenn Miller was too much for him. You know, Count Basie was probably definitely too much for them. But Glenn Miller, these people started to like. You know, you would get a lot of a whole new audience for swing music that would say things like, I don't normally like swing music, but I like Glenn Miller. In particular, Miller helped popularize swing music in the Midwest, more the rural Midwest, and into the American South. One of the sort of dividing lines that separated people that liked swing from people that didn't like swing was sometimes an urban-rural divide. That the more urban you were, the more you tended to like swing music. The more rural you were, the more you might not, that might not be your cup of tea. But what Glenn Miller's Sweet Swing did was help bring in a whole new audience for swing music. Now, part of the key to Glenn Miller's popularity was he had a kind of very squeaky clean image. You know, the members of his band had a kind of all-American, clean-cut look. This was something Miller was very insistent upon, that his musicians look and behave very straight-laced. Okay, this again was going to help him appeal to people in the more rural Midwest, in the American South. Okay, Glenn Miller did not integrate his band. Okay, if you're gonna be appealing more to people in the rural Midwest in the American South, bringing African Americans in your band is not going to do you a lot of good with white folk in those parts of the country. That doesn't mean Glenn Miller was a racist. He was not. It's just, again, he was operating within a racist, largely segregated society. And he didn't have the same kind of audience that Benny Goodman had, for example. Benny Goodman had a much more hipper, cutting-edge kind of fan base, a more hardcore fan base, a more musically literate fan base that was willing and often embraced African Americans in this music. Glenn Miller was popular with an audience that was often less sophisticated, more rural, and probably less enthusiastic about African Americans there. Now, one of the things Miller did after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is he immediately went out and volunteered for military service. A very commendable thing. Other band leaders and other musicians in the swing era did the same thing, but Glenn Miller went out and did it immediately. You know, some band leaders and some musicians waited a little while. They either waited to be drafted or they waited until they could get into the recording studio and record a bunch of records that would be released while they were in the military, because there was a fair amount of fear that, hey, we're going to be at war probably for years. And who knows what the musical landscape is going to be once the war is over. When you're at the top of the music game, enjoy it for as long as it lasts, because for most people, it doesn't really last that long. And so some band leaders, they were going to do their duty. They were going to accept their draft status, or they were going to volunteer. But some of them, you know, they wanted to put some music on record and put it in the can so it could be released and hopefully maintain their popularity while they were serving in the military. But not Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller disbanded his orchestra and signed up for military service. Now, he was inducted into the Army. During World War II, there was no separate Air Force. There was the Army Air Corps, which after the war would split off and become its own separate branch of the military, the Air Force. But Miller served with the Army Air Corps at the time. Now, the Army, they were no dummies. By the time World War II starts, Glenn Miller arguably was the most popular band leader in the United States. They weren't going to strap a rifle in this guy's arm and send him to the front. They were going to let him do what he was good at, and that was to put together a military band and play shows for service members all around the world, and to also go on tours of the United States and raise money to, for example, raise money for war bonds to help finance the war and maintain morale, both domestically and internationally with the troops. Also make records that would be played for service members during the war. The military started to release popular records, and they were known as V-discs, victory discs, to play for service members to keep their morale up while they were away. Miller has a really interesting discussion about how Glenn Miller tried to update military music during World War II. At the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 20th century, military marching music was actually quite popular. And some early records that were the most popular were actually military marching music. In early acoustic recording, the kind of sound that would record really well was loud, brassy instruments. Soft voices and soft instruments didn't record very well. For example, a soft violin was almost invisible to early acoustic recording. It just didn't pick it up. But brassy instruments, like what you have in a marching band, recorded really well. So one of the early recording stars in American recorded music history was John Philip Sousa and his Marine Corps band. His most famous song, Stars and Stripes Forever. You've all heard it. This was a huge selling record early in the history of recorded music. And partly it was because those instruments recorded really well. But what happened after World War I, and you get into the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, is military marching music didn't really evolve from the old style that you heard at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 20th century. So for the old generals that were running the army, what music did they like? They liked the music of their youth, the music that they marched to during World War I. John Philip Sousa kind of stuff. And what Glenn Miller tried to do is he tried to update military music. He knew like the average 18-year-old that's now in the Army or in the Navy or in the Marines, he doesn't want to listen to John Philip Sousa. He wants to listen to Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman or Count Basie. And so he tried to get the military brass to understand that they needed to update the sound of military music to what sounded more like swing music. He tried, but it just didn't work. The brass at the military were just kind of stuck in their ways. They preferred the old-fashioned kind of marching music. And so it just didn't stick. He tried to do it. Now, that was like for marching music, what you heard at official military events. For the service members themselves, when they were dancing at, say, for example, USO shows and things like that, then you heard swing music. And so Glenn Miller, when he was playing for the troops, he was playing swing music for them. And his band came to be known as the All-American Band. By the way, there's Glenn Miller right there. He was a trombone player. Okay. And he's playing with his military band there. But Ehrenberg has an interesting discussion highlighting some of the limits of how far American diversity was willing to go during World War II. Right? So one of the limits was Glenn Miller couldn't bring African Americans into his band in the Army. During World War II, the United States military was still segregated. White and African American soldiers served in the military, but they served in completely separate units. Few years after the end of World War II, there was an integration of the military. By the time you get to the Korean War, which starts 5 years after the end of World War II ends in 1945. American involvement in the Korean War begins in 1950. By that point, the military has been integrated, but during World War II, it was still segregated. So even if Glenn Miller wanted to bring African American soldiers into his army band, he could not do that. Right? And so Ehrenberg highlights the fact that Glenn Miller's band came to be known as the All-American Band. But there was something deeply ironic about that, because how could you have an All-American jazz band that excluded African Americans in that band? It just, and once again, that doesn't mean Glenn Miller was some sort of horrible human being. He was once again operating largely within the bounds of a racist, segregated society at that time, and so there was just a limit of the amount of diversity that America was willing to accept at this point. Let's talk about some changing musical taste that starts to happen during World War II. Swing music still remains very popular throughout the war. Okay? Again, swing music was the soundtrack of World War II. But we also begin to get the growing popularity of vocal music. Now, there are a few reasons why vocal music starts to become more popular. One of the things that Ehrenberg argues is that World War II was an anxious time. It was a time filled with worry and concern. Millions of American men and also some women were going overseas, serving in the military. Some of them did not come back and return. And so when loved ones went off to war, there was the reasonable fear that the person I love may not come back. And Ehrenberg argues that vocal music more directly conveys feeling and emotion. So during a time in which Americans were feeling worried and anxious, vocal music really tapped in and could really express this anxiety. I already played this song for you before when I wanted to talk about Peggy Lee, but let's listen to it again within the context of World War II. This is the Peggy Lee song, Waiting for the Train to Come In, and I want you to focus on the lyrics of the song.
Waiting for the train to come in, waiting for my man to come home. I've counted every minute of each livelong day, been so melancholy since he went away. I've shed a million teardrops or more, waiting for the one I adore. I'm waiting in the depot by the railroad track, looking for the choo-choo train that brings him back. I'm waiting for my life to begin, waiting for the train to come in.
How many millions of American girlfriends and wives were doing the very thing that this song describes? Waiting at the train station, waiting for their loved one to come back. You know, I've shed a million teardrops or more. This is a song that would deeply relate to so many people. That whether it was a girlfriend or wife or a mother or a father worrying about their child coming back from war, that Ehrenberg argues part of the reason for the popularity of vocal music was simply that it could express and convey these emotions directly in the ways that instrumental music just can't do it. Another reason for this growing popularity, is simply that some of these singers that started in swing bands, like Peggy Lee singing with Benny Goodman, were just becoming really famous from their attachment to playing in swing bands. And many of them, especially as we start to get towards World War II, were using their success in swing bands as a springboard to go on and become a solo artist. Control your own career, make a lot more money, get to perform more and sing instead of just being a tiny bit of the evening's entertainment. So many singers that became popular in the 1940s and remained popular in the 1950s, 60s, and the 70s, got their start as singers in swing bands and built that into their own solo career. Okay, Peggy Lee and Frank Sinatra are two male and female examples whose success lasted decades after the swing era was over. There's one other thing that was going to be really important with that, and that was for about 18 months in 1942, 1943, right after World War II starts, there was a musicians' strike that took place. The head of the American Federation of Musicians was very fearful about records. He saw records as a threat to the livelihood of many musicians. Some, particularly the very popular musicians, benefit from recordings. But as more Americans were going to absorb the music they listen to from recorded sources, records that they play at home, music they listen to on the radio, which by World War II, increasingly more records were being played on the radio. What's going to happen to middle-class musicians that used to provide live music in live venues or playing live on the radio for audiences? What's going to happen to them? And so to try to exact concessions from the recording companies, and even potentially to destroy the record business in general, the American Federation of Musicians went on strike for 18 months, and their musicians were barred from going into the recording studio. You could still perform live. That wasn't the issue. The issue was records. And what they wanted is a tax placed on records that would go to a fund for musicians, so that if records continue to sell, they would accumulate a fund of money that would provide money for live concerts, so that working musicians would, for example, give Sunday concerts in the park, and they would get paid for things like that. Now, a really key element of this, to understand why this is important for vocal music, is that singers were not part of the Federation of the United Federation of Musicians. They weren't part of the union. Remember in a previous lecture, I told you that instrument playing musicians tended to look down on singers and not think of them as being real musicians? This is a good example of that. They didn't allow singers to be part of the music union. So therefore, when record companies had a hard time getting musicians to play on records, they had a whole slew of vocalists that were still willing to cut records. And one of the things we associate with the sound of World War II is not simply swing music, but a lot of a cappella music, a lot of singing groups, the Pied Pipers, the Andrews Sisters, and for the first half of World War II, a lot of sort of a cappella music that had very little in the way of instrumentation. One of the most famous songs that was popular during World War II was Rum and Coca-Cola by the Andrews Sisters. And you'll notice it's mostly vocal music. There's a percussionist doing something. There's a piano player. And there's a horn.
Go down Trinidad, they make you feel so very glad. Calypso sing and make up rhyme, guarantee you one real good fine time. Drinking rum and Coca-Cola, go down point.
Okay, again, not one of my favorite songs from the era. But it highlights, you can get some musicians, either non-union musicians or maybe a union musician that was willing to risk their union card to come into the studio and secretly record stuff, although that was really hard because the union did a good job of keeping track of who was performing and what was going on in recording studios. So you were really taking a risk. So those were probably non-union musicians. But notice there was only 3 instruments in that. It was mostly just a cappella sort of vocal music that you got. Okay. One of the reasons vocal music became more important was because you got a lot of recorded vocal music during this period from 1942 into 1943, because the big bands were and other orchestras weren't going into the recording studio and recording much. So you got this increase in vocal music. And as we'll talk about, by the end of World War II, there's going to be a dramatic shift in the nature of music, and we're going to talk about that. And part of this dramatic shift is going to be the growing popularity, the continuous growing popularity of vocal music. Vocal music just resonated with the American public in a way, and it was going to stick. This right here is Jo Stafford. She was originally part of one of those vocal groups, the Pied Pipers. They were 3 women and a man. But then Jo Stafford would go out on her own. And she was so popular as a vocalist during World War II that her nickname became G.I. Joe. That was her nickname for Jo Stafford. She was sort of really beloved by a lot of service members during the war. She was beautiful, but sort of beautiful in a kind of hometown way. She wasn't some sort of bombshell. She was like the sweet girl for home. She was the girl you hoped to settle down with and marry when this war was over. And so many, she was overwhelmed during the war and long afterwards. How many servicemen sent her letters during the war saying, I carried your picture of me throughout the war, because she was G.I. Joe. All right. That's good for this lecture. We got one more in this series on swing music, and I look forward to that. I'll see you next time.